Okay, in my last video I covered a basic overview of Genesis through Deuteronomy. So now we're starting Joshua. Joshua is the next book. As I mentioned, Moses dies, and God has Joshua lead Israel into the promised land, out of the wilderness, into Israel, into Canaan, I guess you could say. That's the next generation. One generation died off in the wilderness, 40 years of wandering around due to their unbelief. So they go under Joshua. Joshua and Caleb were the two spies who believed God and of that previous generation, and so then they get to enter the promised land, whereas the other generation died off. So then under Joshua they enter into the promised land. The book of Joshua is 24 chapters long. It's basically the glory days of Israel, if you want to call it that. That generation that goes into the promised land, it seems like they believe God. You see them going in, the walls of Jericho fall down, you see them conquering different cities. There's bad things that happen, like Ai. It's a small town. They say, okay, well, we'll be able to, we don't need too many troops for that. We'll be able to, cover Ai just fine, conquer them. But there's Achan there, and a man named Achan, A-C-H-A-N, part of Israel. God had told Israel to utterly destroy the Canaanites and not to take any of their possessions. But and it's because of Canaan, they were involved with that basically the devil's seed. They were giants in the land. They had devil blood mixed with human blood, woman's blood, to create these superhuman creatures, these giants. And they were a bunch of unbelievers, and so God says, utterly destroy them. Because if you keep some of their possessions, a lot of the possessions were related to some kind of idol worship. So you say, oh, here's gold or silver or some precious stones, I'd like to keep those. Well, the gold was made into an idol, or the silver made into an idol. And so if you kept the possessions of the nation, the Canaan there, you'd end up keeping their idols. So if you keep the idols, it wouldn't be long before you bow down to them, and so God says, you utterly destroy all that stuff. Well, Achan break your heart. Well, he's the Achan that broke God's heart because he took some of those possessions and hid them. And as a result, God didn't give him the victory. And so God had sentenced Achan to judgment. They killed him. And so that then God resumed with victory for Israel. So the book of Joshua is basically Israel going into the promised land and having faith in God, for the most part, Achan being an exception. And then God giving them the victory, so they're utterly destroying these towns. Jericho is a mighty city, big walls, and God has them all fall down. I mean, they probably look pretty stupid. They're walking around, and they have these pitchers that they break, and they have the trumpet, and they shout, and that's how they win the victory. I mean, you don't usually win a victory by that. Usually you take the sword or you take the guns, you fight. But God is the one giving them the victory, so God has it all done just with the trumpet blast and the breaking of the pitchers and the shout. And so then the walls of Jericho fall down. So Joshua, for the most part, you see Israel believing God, following him. The book of Joshua ends in chapter 24, where Joshua says, basically, I'm getting old, I'm going to die pretty soon, so you won't have my leadership, so what you need to do then is to trust in God, serve the Lord. He says that the famous passage in Joshua 24, it says, choose ye this day whom ye will serve, whether the gods of the Amorites in whose land ye dwell, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And that wasn't a complete quote, but basically that's what he says there. He says, you make the decision. I'm going to die. I've had you serving the Lord for this generation, but now I won't be around, so now you're going to have to decide what you're going to do. So then the book of Joshua ends, the book of Judges starts, and the book of Judges covers about a 490-year period, I believe. Stephen says that in Acts chapter 7. And Judges chapter 2 gives you a summary of it. What happens is Israel, then after Joshua dies, that next generation that comes up after Joshua's leadership, they decide to serve the idols and the gods of the land of Canaan, because that's what they were. The Canaanites were pagans. They didn't serve God. They served their own idols. They served other gods. And so Israel takes up those other gods and starts serving them. So then God, Judges 2 basically gives you a summary of those whole 490 years. That Israel serves these other gods, they take them up, and so then God punishes them for doing so. They get taken captive by a city. Israel never fully takes over the land of Israel. And God told them like that. In other words, He's not going to give them the entire promised land in one generation, because He wants to try them and test them. If each generation, successive generation, serves the Lord, then eventually they would take over the entire promised land. But they never did. And so when they serve other gods, then God raises up one of the nations or one of the cities that is in Canaan, and they come and they take Israel captive, and they start oppressing Israel. So then Israel, they basically go, remember the number 40? Well, you'll see it again. They basically go through 40-year cycles. So they submit about 40 years where they serve all these idols, and then finally they turn to God, and God says, okay, I will bring a judge, which really, don't think of a judge in terms of what we think, where you go into a court and you have a judge. The judge is really a deliverer. It's somebody who judges their sin, basically, and God promises to forgive them of their sin because they turn back to the Lord. So they have approximately, say, 40 years or so where they serve other gods, then ask for deliverance. God brings them, due to their sin, they're captive by another nation or another city. So then they ask for deliverance. God brings deliverance through a judge. And so then the judge is somebody who is a Bible believer, stands for the Lord, believes in God. And so they come and not only deliver them from the nation that's oppressing them, but more importantly, they get them to turn back to God and serving God. And so then they serve God for about 40 years. There's peace in the land. And then that judge or deliverer dies off. And so then they go right back, and the next generation goes right back into idolatry. And so then they ask for God to save them, and then God saves them. And that you see that cycle repeated. About 40 years in captivity, being oppressed, serving other gods. They ask for deliverance. Then God delivers them. And then for 40 years, they have peace and they're serving God. Then another 40 years, then they serve other idols and serve other gods. Then they get captured and are oppressed. And then another 40 years, the deliverer is brought, another 40 years of peace. And so you have those cycles repeat for the time of the Judges, which covers about 490 years. And it's, I believe, 21 chapters in the book of Judges. But unfortunately, what happens is as time goes on, it gets harder and harder to find somebody who will believe God to be a deliverer, and Israel gets more hardened to the point where they don't want to be delivered, and they like their sin, and they continue to wallow in their sin, and they don't care, and they don't turn to God. So that's what you've got. It gets worse and worse as time goes on. So you've got, for example, Gideon is one of the judges, but Gideon, one of the first things he does is he tears down an idol that his father has, and he has to do it at night because he's afraid they're going to try to do something against him for doing it. And when they finds out in the day, well, then they get all upset with him. God, with Gideon, has a very small army to go against the Midianites, to make it clear that it's not because of their strength, not by might or by power, but by my spirit, saith the Lord. So it's the Lord who brings victory with a very small army. I think it ends up being 300 men, if I'm not mistaken. Gideon has this big army, and then God says, that's too many, get rid of some. And they get rid of some. Oh, that's too many, get rid of some. And you get down to 300. And then God brings the victory. But when he does bring the victory, Gideon stands for the Lord, but he also stands for himself. The sword of the Lord and of Gideon. It's not just the sword of the Lord, but it's also of Gideon. He's trying to exalt himself too. After that, you get down to Samson. Probably the most famous judge was Samson. Well, Samson was a Nazarite. For that, God had to basically set him apart from birth. He's a Nazarite from birth. He's born of godly parents. And then then God does miracles through him, giving him superhuman strength. And he still won't serve the Lord. He's following after a Philistine woman, and then she doesn't like it, so then he follows after Delilah. Samson and Delilah, another Philistine woman. And So basically, he's after women and after the pleasures of the flesh, using his superhuman strength not for the Lord, but for himself. And then finally, it's at the very end of his life, after he's been caught, he's lost his strength, and his eyes have gouged out, that he finally turns to the Lord, and he kills himself. Well, what he does is he pushes down a pillar, and all these Philistines are killed. And so he kills more Philistines in that one act than he did in his entire life before that. But he's blind, and he doesn't have the strength, so God gives him a one last burst of strength where he's able to push this pillar down, which supports the entire house. The roof caves in and kills all the Philistines in there, but it also kills himself too. And so you see the judges, at first you'll see judges, and they just come and give the deliverance, and they turn to the Lord, and it's fine. But as the judges period goes on, yes, the Lord does bring a judge or a deliverer. Yes, there's peace in the land. But to find somebody, it's increasingly difficult. God has to give superhuman strength to Samson, or else he won't be a deliverer. And he can't find anybody else. So he has to make him a Nazirite from birth and give him superhuman strength. And then at the last second, his last act is he's a deliverer by killing himself, but a whole bunch of Philistines in the process too. And so it shows how bad it gets, to the point where you get to the story that happens toward the end of the book of Judges. I believe it's around chapter 19. And this was significant because we skipped over it. I briefly mentioned it, but they're in Sodom and Gomorrah. In Sodom and Gomorrah, when Lot, and this is back in Genesis chapter 18 or so, God says Sodom and Gomorrah is utterly wicked. Now, Abraham's nephew named Lot, L-O-T, he is a believer. Now, he's not acting like it, but he does believe in God. But he's in this wicked city. This wicked city has gotten to him. And so God sends these angels, 2 angels who look like men, to come and spy out Sodom and see if there are 10 righteous. He promised Abraham, if there are at least 10 righteous people, at least 10 believers here in this big wicked city of Sodom and Gomorrah, I won't destroy it. And he finds out that the angels find out, the men find out that they're actually just one righteous person, which is Lot. And he doesn't act like a righteous person. So then he says to Lot and his family to get out of there. And what he does is he brings judgment upon them. Well, before that happens, all the men of the city knock down Lot's door, and they want to have sex with the 2 men who are really angels that came to them, because they could see they're good looking, because they're, angels are above men. So yeah, they're in the body of men, but they look, attractive. So and it's men, it's sodomy. That's where the word sodomy comes from. Is Sodom and Gomorrah, is that the men of the city want to have sex with these men. And Lot's trying to keep them doing it, so they just want to do it by force. It shows they're just brute beasts is what they are. Wholly given over to their own lusts. They don't care about the other man. They're going to kill Lot if he doesn't let them in. Lot says, well, I have my 2 daughters. You could have sex with them. No, we don't want them. We don't want women. We want men. We want to have sex with men. So the angels end up blinding the people, and so that they go away, so it doesn't happen, and then God destroys the city. But I mention all that because when you get to Judges, and I believe it's around chapter 19, maybe 18 or 19, actually before then, you've got 2 significant things that happen at the end of the book of Judges. Judges 17, you've got Micah, who is a priest of the Lord. But they're serving Baal, they're serving other gods. And so the people want to serve other gods, but they want to have this cloak or this form of godliness. And so they hire Micah, they give him a bunch of money for him to be a priest. And so he's wholly given over to idolatry, but he does things serving in the name of the Lord. And so what they've done is they've created a religion, but they've said that they do it in God's name. And that's the worst of all. It's bad enough if you reject God and you serve Baal and these other gods, Baal and Ashtaroth. But when you take on God's name and serve these other gods, that's blasphemy. You're blaspheming God's name. And that's what happens today. Catholic Church, prime example. They say they're serving God, but they're serving Baal. and Ashtaroth, queen of heaven. Ashtaroth is the queen of heaven. Baal, I should say, Baal is the sun god. It's really a name for Satan. And Ashtaroth is the queen of heaven, which is the religion. And Satan, knowing that the seed of the woman would bring the Redeemer, then what he does is he creates a religion whereby a woman is worshipped as the queen of heaven. So you make the woman the object of worship rather than her seed, the Lord Jesus Christ. And so that is depicted with goddesses, and these images that are made are of women. That's Ashtaroth, the queen of heaven. And what happens is they would have idols in Israel, and we'll get to this when we get to the kings, but they had idols that were worshiping Baal, the sun god, which is a representation of Satan. But then they'd also have these groves, and which would be these idols of women, and they would worship, but they would have trees around the idols. And the reason they did that is because they would have orgies related to it would be a sexual type of worship. In other words, I worship this queen of heaven, this woman, by having sex. And so they would have trees around it, so it's sort of hidden. But at the same time, it's not hidden from the host of heaven. So they worship the queen of heaven, can see the sexual things they're doing in that grove, and then that would be giving glory and honor to the queen of heaven. And that the queen of heaven was named Ashtaroth. So, and you'll see that in the book of Judges, is that Israel is given over to Baal and Ashtaroth. So that's what it means. Worshiping Satan directly as the Baal or the sun god, which is a representation of Satan, or worshiping him through the queen of heaven, a false god to mimic the seed of the woman through which Jesus would come. And so you worship the woman rather than the seed, and so then they will worship Ashtaroth, the queen of heaven, through these sexual orgies that they would have in these groves. Okay, so the first thing that's bad in Judges around chapter 17 is this Micah, and he's bad because he creates a religion that is in the name of God, but is still worshiping Baal and Ashtaroth. And you see that today with Catholicism, most all of churchianity. That's what they do. It's a very subtle form of idolatry and serving Satan, but they're still following the lie program, even though they claim to be following God and the Bible, His Word. So that's the first thing you've got there. Then the next thing is around Judges 19 or so. There is a man who is journeying through Jerusalem, through Judah, through Israel, I should say Israel. Judah isn't made yet, it's Israel. And he's going to stay, he needs a place to stay. And there's this old man who lets him stay with him. And so this man who's traveling, he has his young virgin with him. I want to say it's his daughter. I want to say it's his daughter, or no, it's probably his wife. I think it's a young wife is what it is. The man, it's around Judges 19, you can read the story. But basically what happens is this man is traveling with this young woman, who I believe is his wife, maybe his daughter. And they stay the night at this old man's house, and when they do, there are men of Israel who come in and they want to have sex with this woman. Basically group sex, just continuously multiple people raping her just over and over. And so the man, which I believe it's his wife, because he did just, or a young woman with him that he was having sex with, I guess. He didn't really care about her. So then he just lets her and says, okay, finally, they're going to take him by force. The old man is trying to stop him, and they say, get away from us, old man. We're just going to have sex with this girl that's here. And so then the man who had the young woman with him finally lets the young woman out on the doorstep, and they just repeatedly rape her all night to the point where she dies. So the next morning, because he didn't care too much about her, he just next morning says, okay, let's go. Doesn't check on how you doing or anything, or try to stop him, and finds out she's dead. And so what that shows at the end of the book of Judges, and the book of Judges ends by saying every man did what was right in his own eyes. So it shows how Israel was supposed to utterly destroy the Canaanites and their gods and those things, and then serve the Lord God. But the story of what happens at the end of Judges in Israel is very similar to what happened in Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom and Gomorrah, men tried to rape men, angels. Lot offers a woman instead, women, but they don't take them, so they try to rape these men. But since they're angels, they can't do it. The angels stop them and blind them. Well, at the end of the book of Judges, you've got men who try to rape this woman, and since she's not supernatural, she's not an angel, they're able to do so. And they just repeatedly rape her all night long to the point where she's dead. And so then they say, okay, and they just leave her on the doorstep. They don't do anything. So it shows how evil Israel has become, that they just do whatever they want by the end of the book of Judges. So you have the 490 years of they're in the land and they serve God, but then they go into idolatry. So then God brings them into captivity. Then they plead to God. So then there's another judge, and they serve God under that judge's time, but then they go back and serve idolatry. But as these cycles progress through the 490 years, eventually they get to the point where they're not serving God at all. And they are just as evil as Sodom and Gomorrah at the end of the book of Judges. So that's a 490-year period. I believe the book of Judges is 21 chapters. Then you've got the next book after Judges is Ruth, R-U-T-H, Ruth. It's 4 chapters. And it's just a story of something that happens during that time period of the Judges. But it's a story to remind you that even though Israel is in, every man's doing what is right in his own eyes, it's to remind you that there is still a believing remnant, and it's to remind you that God has not forgotten Israel, and that God will bring deliverance to the nation of Israel through the seed of the woman and through a Jewish woman. And so Ruth is a type of that. Ruth is a Moabitess woman. She's from Moab, so she's not an Israelite, but she's married to an Israelite. And so they're in Israel. Well, her husband dies. And so she chooses, now she has a sister who's same situation. And her husband also dies. And so the mother of the two, the wife, the mother of the two there, Naomi, she says, well, you go back to your land, you go back to Moab, wherever you came from, and you go back there because your husbands are dead. And so the one sister, Orpah, not Oprah, but Orpah, O-R-P-A-H, Orpah says, yeah, that's what I'm going to do. But Ruth says, no. She says, I'm going to go with you. Naomi is going to go back to Israel. And Ruth says, no, I'm going to go to Israel. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. So she has faith. She's trusting in the God of Israel rather than going back to Moabite gods. And so God rewards her for her faithfulness, because there's a man in Israel who is a near kinsman to her former husband. His name is Boaz. And so he basically is the kinsman redeemer. I mean, here's a woman, you understand back then, she doesn't have much money. She's poor. So she gleaned the fields. Under the Levitical laws, it said that when you have fields, food, you harvest it, but there's going to be some that are not picked up by the harvesters, and so just leave them there. Don't take every single morsel of every single food. Leave those there, and so then the poor of the land then can glean it. So if they can go and pick up enough corn or whatever food they need from there, and then that way they don't starve to death. So it's sort of like a built-in welfare program that God had for them. You have your crops and everything, and you harvest them and get the majority of them, but then the ones you miss here and there, you just leave there. You don't pick up everything so that the poor people can have food to eat. And so Ruth is poor. She's gleaning the field. And Boaz is rich, and he sees her doing that. And he is a near kinsman. And so he offers to become her kinsman redeemer. Basically, it is that she has faith that Boaz will help her in her situation. She's poor. She has no husband. What is she going to do? And so she trusts in Boaz to save her, and then Boaz marries her, and so by marrying her, then she becomes his wife, and so then she is saved. And so all of that 4 chapters of Ruth, is really just a story, a type of what God wants to do for Israel. Israel has no power within themselves to save themselves due to their sin, so they are spiritually poor. But God, of course, is spiritually rich, and so he's going to send a kinsman redeemer, a Jew, the Lord Jesus Christ, born of a Hebrew woman, to save them from their sins. And so the book of Ruth is a reminder of that, where here's Ruth. She trusts in God to save her, and she's poor. She can't even live on her own. And so then Boaz, being the rich person, she goes to Boaz to try to get salvation. And then Boaz agrees to save her, agrees to marry her, and give her that salvation. So Boaz is her kinsman redeemer, just like Jesus is the kinsman redeemer for the Jews, or for Israel. And so the book of Ruth is set in the time of the Judges, the book of Judges. Those things literally do happen. There is a literal person named Ruth. There is a literal person named Boaz. Those things literally happen, but they're a type, or to show you in story form that God has not forsaken Israel, even though Israel is evil and wicked, and they're just doing whatever they do. They're almost like Sodom and Gomorrah. And in fact, in Isaiah chapter 1, God calls the rulers of Israel, you rulers of Sodom, ye rulers of Gomorrah. So he actually calls them that, spiritually speaking. That's what they're down to. They're so evil. But yet, in spite of that situation, God will still redeem them. He will still send Jesus to be their kinsman redeemer, to give them life. And so that's illustrated by the book of Ruth. And that happens during the times of the Judges. Then you get to 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel introduces a new period in Israel's history in 2 respects. The problem with having a judge, and you could have a good judge and everything is just fine, because he would deliver Israel from their enemy and also get them to serve the Lord. But by the time you get toward the end of that judge period, you don't have people like that. It's hard to find somebody who will serve the Lord. And so you get like Samson, for example. So he's a deliverer. God gives him superhuman strength to deliver them, but he doesn't serve the Lord. So to find somebody who would deliver them, number one, and serve the Lord, number two, it's hard to find that. So what ends up happening, in fact, one of the judges in the book of Judges is a woman, Deborah, and a woman is not supposed to bring deliverance, but there was no man who would do it. So God has to use a woman to help it along. So the issue when you get into that 490 years, see, God was their king, so they didn't have kings. But the problem is they're not listening to God, and then so to find somebody who would actually listen to God and deliver Israel from their captors, that's going to be hard. It's nearly impossible to find by the time you get to the end of the book of Judges. So what happens is God raises up a prophet. Now Abraham was a prophet. A prophet is somebody who just says what the Lord, he speaks for the Lord. He says, thus saith the Lord. But you don't only have the times of the prophets until you get to 1 Samuel. God calls, there's a story of Hannah there at the 1 Samuel chapter 1. Hannah and her husband are God-fearing people. Hannah was barren, and she wanted a child, and she prayed to the Lord and said, if you will give me a child, a male child, I will give him to you. And so God honors her, gives her a boy, names him Samuel, and then Samuel lives in the temple. He grows up in the temple of the Lord. And so when Samuel, as a child, God speaks to Samuel and has Samuel then, Samuel's job in his entire life is to be the prophet of Israel. So then he would speak for the Lord. People would go to him and he would say, thus saith the Lord. This is what the Lord says. Because people walk by sight, because Israel's walking by sight and not by faith, God could have led Israel. It could lead them through those judges. But because they won't listen to God himself, they listen by sight, then what God does is, due to the unbelief of Israel, he raises up prophets, and the prophets speak for the Lord. So now they have to have a human person speak the words of the Lord to them because of their unbelief. They just won't read the book of Deuteronomy and follow what it says or follow the Levitical law. They need a person to actually tell them what they're doing, and a lot of times it's warning them of their idolatry and warning them of God's punishment. So the era of the prophets starts with Samuel there in 1 Samuel. So God, it's a supernatural type birth, although it's done through physical means. He has a father and a mother, but the mother is not able to bear children for whatever reason. So God makes her womb come alive where she can have Samuel. So Samuel is born. And he is the prophet speaking for the Lord. And around chapter 8 of 1 Samuel, what man does, so now they've already got, so the twofold purpose of the judge was, number one, to deliver them from their enemies, and number two, to get them to follow the Lord. And now what happens is that now you've got a prophet who is going to speak for the Lord. And now, and around 1 Samuel chapter 8, Israel says, we want to be like all the other nations. All the other nations have a king to rule them. We want a king to rule us. And God says, well, I am your king, but I see you don't follow me, so then I will give you what you want. I will give you a king. So he gives them what they want. Remember, they're walking by sight and not by faith. So they're not looking for a good godly man, but they're looking for a king to rule them so they can follow their idolatry and the lust of the flesh and all that stuff. And so God gives them Saul. Saul is a Benjamite. He's of the tribe of Benjamin, the 12 tribes. That's one of the 12 tribes. And so Saul is their first king there, of course, apart from God, first man king there. And he is the most handsome man in all Israel. He's, the tall, dark, and handsome. That's what he is. In fact, 1 Samuel says that he is a head taller than everybody else. So, if you line everybody up in height order in Israel, how many million there are, a few million people there, the tallest one would be Saul, and he's a full head taller than all of them. So in the flesh, he looks like he's just going to be a great king. So the book of 1 Samuel is, you see Saul there. The book of 1 Samuel is 31 chapters, I think, and it ends in Saul dying. Saul's death. So it starts with Samuel being born and the start of the prophets, and then the death of the first king, Saul. And what you see under Saul is that he continues what Micah had done at the end of Judges. Is, remember, they serve all these idols, but they do it in the name of the Lord. Well, Saul, you don't see really him bowing down to these idols, but you see him making up a bunch of religious laws. At one time, Israel was going to fight against the Philistines, and Saul says, no man shall eat until the Philistines are killed. And so they're all, that's a stupid law. But why would you do that? If anybody needs food, it's the people who are fighting the battles. Give them plenty of food so they have the strength to fight. But he's just a religious guy. One time, then, he was supposed to wait for Samuel to come after the victory was made. And then Samuel would offer, as the prophet, would offer something to the Lord there. But he doesn't wait for Samuel. And so then he just offers thousands of animals he has killed. So this is how we're going to worship the Lord's victory that he gave to us. We're just going to kill a bunch of animals. And that's where God says through Samuel, well, obedience is better than sacrifice. He does the sacrifice, but he was supposed to wait for Samuel to come. So Saul is known as this religious guy who takes on the name of the Lord and does all these great things for the Lord, but it's just lip service. He doesn't really believe in the Lord. And in fact, so what happens is, since he doesn't follow the Lord, then the Lord tells him through Samuel that the kingdom is taken away from you. In fact, when Saul sins by doing those sacrifices and not waiting for Samuel, Samuel calls him out and says he sins, and Saul says, well, no, I didn't. These are to the Lord. So he keeps reverting back to his religion. Just like people today, they're sinners bound for hell, never believe the gospel, But they'll say, well, what do you mean? I serve God because I go to church and I pay tithes. I'm a member of a church. I read scripture in church. So obviously I'm following God. But no, they never believe the gospel. They're never saved. That's what Saul is. He's your average churchgoer. You know, he does all these mighty great things for God, but it's just lip service. He doesn't really serve God. And so God says the kingdom is taken away from you. And now God's going to replace him with God's choice as king. And God's choice as king, he calls him a man after his own heart, is David. At the time that he does it, David is the youngest of, I believe, 7 sons, maybe 8. I think it's 8. He's the 8th, the youngest of 8 sons of Jesse. By the way, the book of Ruth ends where she has a boy. Ruth and Boaz have a son named Obed, and Obed gives birth to Jesse eventually, and Jesse gives birth to David. So you've got the kingly or the royal line of God's royal line goes through Ruth for her faithfulness to God. So anyway, God has Samuel anoint David as king over Israel. Is going to replace Saul, but Saul remains as the official king, so to speak, until he dies, which is at the end of 1 Samuel. There you've got, just after he's anointed king, which I believe is around chapter 15 or chapter 16 of 1 Samuel. Chapter 17, you got the famous story of David and Goliath. He's already been anointed king. He's probably a teenager at this point, not quite 20, because he's not part of the fighting armies. He's there to bring food to his older brothers. So he's probably a teenager at the time. And he fights against Goliath and defeats him. So not him, of course, it's God through him giving the victory. And it's interesting that David took 5 stones, and there's scripture to support the idea that Goliath had 4 brothers. And so the reason he took 5 stones was 1 stone for each, for Goliath and his 4 brothers, which his 4 brothers didn't come against him. They were all scared by that point. But he was ready not to just kill Goliath, but to also kill his 4 giant brothers. So you have the story of the rest of the 1 Samuel is Saul and David. And Saul is wanting to kill David because he's jealous that he's going to be in God's kingdom and the kingdom's taken away from him, that David is the king. And you have this back and forth, but David won't kill Saul, even though he has plenty of opportunity to do so, because he won't strike God's anointed, because Saul is still the king until he dies. And then 1 Samuel ends where Saul is in battle. He's disguised himself so you don't know he's the king, and he actually gets killed by the enemy. And so he dies, Saul dies that way. But all of that is a type to show of how what we do as believers today is that we don't go out and kill bad rulers. That's not our job. We submit to those who have authority over us, even though they're bad rulers, and even though we would do a much better job. It doesn't matter, because they have the authority over us. Satan is the god of this world, and we submit to their authority, knowing that when we die, we'll be under the rulership of the Lord Jesus Christ, and Christ will live in us in heaven. So we don't need to worry about it. Just like David submitted to the rule of Saul, even though Saul was trying to kill him, and David had ample opportunity to kill Saul himself, but he trusted in the Lord, and eventually Saul was killed by an enemy, and then David takes the throne. So 1 Samuel ends with Saul's death. Then 2 Samuel, which I believe is about 25 chapters, 2 Samuel is basically the story of David as he is king, a man after God's own heart. But we see there in 2 Samuel that he does a few things that he shouldn't do, that is not after God, which shows that he's not perfect. He still has this sin nature. And that's encouraging for us. We can be a man after God's own heart in that we have recognized our sin, we've trusted in Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection as atonement for our sin, and we can do great things for God in that we believe God's word, we get the sound doctrine found in Paul's epistles, and use the mind of Christ. But there are going to be times where we do some bad stuff, and times where we do some really bad stuff. And God's forgiven us of those sins. David did really great things for God, and he was king. There was a lot of conquering of territories. A lot of great riches came into Israel under King David, because God would bring the victories. Usually it was the Philistines he was fighting, and God would bring great victories through that. And so he would put up the treasures in his storehouse. His desire was to build a temple for God, but God says, well, you're not going to do it. Your son will do that. And we'll get into that a little later. So David gets, basically 2 Samuel is the story of the things that happened under David. And you see all the great battles he wins and how Israel expands and grows under him. But there are 3 really bad things that he does to show that he's human. And he also gets consequences for that. The first one is that there's a woman named Bathsheba who is married to Uriah. And Uriah is one of the mighty men of valor in David's army. And David sees Bathsheba and sleeps with her. So he commits adultery with Bathsheba. Then Bathsheba, through him sleeping with her, becomes pregnant. And so then he tries to cover it up. So what he does is he gets Uriah to come back from war and basically wants him to sleep with his wife. And so then when a baby is born, everybody will assume it's Uriah's child. So David commits adultery, and then he tries to cover up the sin by the child being saying, oh, that's Uriah's child. But Uriah wouldn't have sex with his wife when he brought him back from the battle, because he says, well, how can I do that? How can I enjoy lying with my wife when my fellow countrymen are out there in battle? So as long as my fellow countrymen are in battle, I'm going to be having that mindset of being in battle. I'm not going to get into the pleasures of being with my wife. So then, since that didn't work, trying to cover up the pregnancy, the adultery, the pregnancy as a result of it, then David has Uriah killed. And so the first 2 bad things that David does is he commits adultery, and he murders the husband of the woman that he committed adultery with. So adultery and murder. But God says he's a man after my own heart. So yes, he did these things and it's part of the sin nature, but God says he's forgiven. I will not impute sin to his account. So he was eternally secure because he had faith in what God told him, and he had the works of faith in that. You could see that in that all the battles that he won for the Lord and building up these treasures for the Lord and wanting to build a temple. So all those are works of faith. So he says he's got faith and he's got works of faith, so he's justified. Therefore, I'm not going to impute a sin to his account, even though it's 2 of the 7 deadly sins, what the Catholics say are deadly sins, adultery and murder, which shows that all sins really are deadly. And if you've got forgiveness of sins, all sins are forgiven by God, and so there are no deadly sins then. And there are no degrees of that. Now, there's degrees of consequences. There's a lot greater consequences that come from adultery and murder than come from just telling a lie, but they're still all sins because they're still all defying God, not walking in faith, but by your own flesh. And David faced consequences from his sins. The child that was born by Bathsheba died. And God told David through the prophet Nathan, which, by the way, was one of David's sons. And again, we've got that prophetic program started with Samuel, was that first prophet. And so you have speaking prophets throughout here. And 1 Samuel, and then 2 Samuel, and 1 Kings, and 2 Kings. You've got these prophets throughout that history there. And they are speaking for the Lord. And so the prophet Nathan tells David that his child is going to die because it was out of wedlock. It was adultery. He committed adultery by having sex with Bathsheba. Therefore, the child would die. Now then, David had Uriah killed, and then David marries Bathsheba, and then she has a son after that who is Solomon, and God makes that child king. So even though David indulged his sin nature and did some really bad things that he shouldn't have done, God still blesses him because he knows he's a man after God's own heart. He has forgiveness of sins, but he still has the natural consequences of sin, in that the child dies that he had the adultery with, Bathsheba's son, dies. And from then on, David has family issues. Sons, Absalom tries to usurp David's authority and take the throne. David isn't as forceful or as aggressive or on fire for God, if you want to say it that way, after that, because he recognizes his failings, his sin. So when Absalom tries to take over the throne, David doesn't do a whole lot to try to stop it. David promises that eventually he marries Bathsheba and has Solomon, and since Bathsheba is the woman that David loved, then David promises that Solomon will take the throne after him. He will be his son. So anyway, 2 Samuel goes through the history of David as king. The third thing, I said there were three things, really bad things that David did. First was adultery with Bathsheba. Second was killing Bathsheba's husband Uriah. Third is he numbered Israel. And that was bad because he was supposed to be, Israel was supposed to be as numerous as the sand on the seashore. That's what he told Abraham when in Genesis 21. And so that means you can't number them. Well, David numbered them. And so David committed sin there. In fact, a lot of people died in Israel as a result of that sin. So there were consequences to it. But at the same time, God gave forgiveness of the sin, and so David is still going to be in God's kingdom. And in fact, the book of Ezekiel says, around chapter 37 of Ezekiel, that David is going to be co-regent or king with Jesus himself in God's eternal kingdom on earth. So David gets, I guess you could say, apart from Jesus, David has the highest position of authority in God's kingdom on earth in Israel in eternity. And yet he murdered, he committed adultery, he numbered the people. He did some really bad stuff, which shows that even the best among us are not perfect. Even those who read God's word, believe what it says, seek to use the mind of Christ in every situation, you're still going to make mistakes. And you'll make some really big mistakes. And there'll be bad impacts to those mistakes in your life. But yet, God is gracious and has forgiven you of those sins by the blood of Christ. That's the main thing to learn from David. So then, 2 Samuel ends. The book of 1 Kings starts in chapter 1, where David is old. He's about to die, and Bathsheba basically Absalom is acting like, now Absalom is one of David's sons. David had multiple wives, which God allowed at that time. He shouldn't have done it. That was another big sin. I guess I should say 4 sins, because although a regular person a regular man could have multiple wives, the king in the book of Deuteronomy says that a king was not to multiply wives unto himself. And that's what David did. So I guess you could say 4 sins got him. Adultery, murder, numbering people, and being a polygamist. So anyway, here's Absalom, which was not from Bathsheba, but from a different wife of David. And Absalom is acting like, David is old, so he can't really operate as king so much. So Absalom is acting like he's the king. And so Bathsheba comes to David in 1 Kings 1, I think it is, or it may be chapter 2. And he says, wait a minute here. You said that my son Solomon's going to be king. Look what Absalom's doing. So then David anoints Solomon to be king. Very briefly, you've got Absalom trying to be king as well, and there's some fighting there. But anyway, Solomon ends up taking over and being the king. Absalom is killed in a battle, and so then Solomon ends up being the full-fledged king. David dies, I think, at the end of chapter 2, maybe, somewhere around 1 Kings chapter 2. And then Solomon is now the king, which is David's son, taking over there. Now, Solomon, God says, well, he's in a privileged position. David took over from an evil king, Saul, a religious king, Saul. And he did all these, David was a man of war. He fought all these battles and won a lot of victories for Israel over the Philistines. And so won those victories. Well, Solomon is then basically growing up in a household, when it's more of a peaceful time. Israel is enlarged because of all these victories that have won. He's not really a man of war, and he grows up in a favored system in that his father is a man after God's own heart and has got all these blessings. And so what God does to Solomon, it's around 1 Kings chapter 3 or 4, I think it is, and he says, okay, I recognize you, Solomon, as the successor to David. So ask me anything and I will do it for you. I'll start you off with a blessing because you're David's son. I'll start you off with a blessing. And so Solomon says, well, I'm just a young kid. I don't know much about these things. And so I'm the king. I got awful big responsibility and I'm just a youngin'. So I want to have wisdom. And so God says, well, you asked very good because you didn't ask for riches. You asked for wisdom. So I'm going to give you wisdom and I'm going to give you riches. And so Solomon ends up being the wisest person to ever live. I guess now you could say, Jesus is wiser. And if you look at, say, somebody like Paul, well, he would be wiser because he's got the mystery. But in terms of earthly wisdom, the things of this world, I think Solomon was the wisest person to ever live. Because God gave him special wisdom that no one else has ever been able to match, at least as far as the world's wisdom, earthly wisdom is concerned. And so, but he also gives him great riches. And so what Solomon does for the most part is, now he writes, and we'll get to this later, he writes the books of Proverbs, Song of Solomon, and Ecclesiastes. And those books tell you, you learn from them his life, but also they're in 1 Kings. You learn from 1 Kings. Solomon had, I want to say it was 700 wives and 1,000 concubines, or it may have been 300 wives and 700 concubines. Anyway, he had at least 1,000 wives total, at least 1,000 different women that he was sleeping with. And he had great riches. It shows that what Solomon did, while he asked for wisdom, and he had great wisdom, such that he wrote Proverbs, the Song of Solomon, and Ecclesiastes. Those are the books of wisdom, and we'll get to those when we get there. But the problem is, because he had so much in the material world as well, and the wisdom brought him that. There was the Queen of Sheba who came to him and asked him, tried him with these hard questions, and saw that his wisdom, Solomon's wisdom, exceeded the wisdom of anybody else who's ever lived. And so then she gives him great riches. So he has great riches, and the reason he has those riches is because he is going to be the one who builds the temple of the Lord. But the problem is he lets the material wealth and the things of this world go to his head, and he doesn't serve the Lord for the most part in his life. It seems like at the end, when you read Ecclesiastes, it seems like at the end he does fear God, keep his commandments, he does serve the Lord, he trusts in God to save him, and so it does appear that Solomon is probably in God's kingdom on earth. You can't say that with absolute certainty, but I do say the main reason I would say that, because it's kind of hard to tell, is because his conclusion in Ecclesiastes is to fear God and keep his commandments, which is what I think he did at the end of his life. Not that he keeps the law perfectly, but keeping the commandments in the sense that he fears God and he trusts in God to save him. And I think that's what he did at the end. But the main reason I think Solomon is a saved person is because he wrote Proverbs, Song of Solomon, and Ecclesiastes. And 2 Peter 1 says that the scripture came, the Holy Ghost, the holy men wrote down the words that the Holy Ghost gave them, and that's how we have the Bible. He could say he's holy in the sense that he's set apart for God, but I don't think anybody wrote scripture who is not a saved person, who is not in God's kingdom. For God to say holy men wrote down holy scriptures, they're holy by the blood of Jesus, which means they're saved people. So because Solomon wrote Proverbs, Song of Solomon, and Ecclesiastes, then I believe that he is a saved person. Okay. So you have the story of Solomon, and you can see, though, for the most part, though, he serves his own material riches and his own flesh, because while he does take great riches that David had set aside and that Solomon got and builds the probably the most beautiful and expensive building that's ever been built in the world's history, which was the temple. Pounds and hundreds of pounds of gold going into it. Very expensive thing. Very beautiful thing. It was built by Solomon. He spent 7 years getting the temple built for the Lord. Well, he spent 14 years building his own house. So that tells you who he liked better, himself over God. And if he's got 1,000 wives, and in fact it tells you that the women that he slept with, the wives and the concubines, turned his heart away from the Lord, and he served their gods. Because these were women, a lot of the women that he married were foreigners. Because remember, they're still there. Israel never fully took over the promised land. So you got these other women from these other nations there, and so he ends up sleeping with them as well. And so they lead his heart away. The book of 1 Kings tell you that these women led his heart away from God, and he served other gods. So Solomon, for his lifetime, for the most part, does a lot of bad things, but it seems like in the end, he did turn to God, trusting in God to save him, and the great wisdom that God gave him is shown to us in Proverbs, Song of Solomon, and Ecclesiastes, and things that he did in his life as well in book of 1 Kings. Solomon, though, turns away from God, and the danger in building that great temple is, again, man is going to walk by sight and not by faith, which is why God didn't want David to build the temple in the first place. He knew that building a big temple like that would get people's heart away from God. And you look at today, people go to churches usually because they like the big steeples, which are really male phallic symbols, and they like the stained glass windows, and it's such a beautiful building. Like Matthew 24, you see that. When the disciples are sitting on the Mount of Olives with Jesus, they're looking at, and the disciples are admiring how beautiful the temple is. And Jesus says, why are you worried about that? That's going to be destroyed. Well, when? And so Matthew 24, he tells you about the end times, the tribulation period. But anyway, it's so easy for man to trust in worldly things. And so God was completely fine with just a little tent that Israel carried around in the wilderness and dwelling in that, because he wants to dwell with them and them to love him and to fear him and to trust in him to save them and to obey his commandments. He doesn't care about them bowing down to some wonderful temple that's full of gold. So God didn't really want the big fancy temple in the first place, but he knew that that was necessary due to the idolatry and the wickedness of man. So he didn't allow it in David's time, because David was a man after God's own heart, but he did allow it in Solomon's day. So Solomon builds the beautiful Solomon's temple, and that's what the Freemasons worship, not God, they worship the temple and Solomon. And so then after Solomon dies, then you've got his son Rehoboam becomes king. But what God does, remember what he did at the Tower of Babel, is because of man's evil, his wickedness, man was all united in their wickedness against God. And so God creates 70 different languages and creates 70 different nations so that they're at odds with each other. So Israel has gotten to the point, we see through the period of the Judges, that they're bad. They have a reprieve, which God refers to in Isaiah as the sure mercies of David. They have a reprieve during the days of Saul and David and Solomon, which is about 120 years there, where they're in the land, they're at peace, and they're sort of serving God. At least under David they are, but they're still serving idols as well, especially when you get to Solomon's day. Well, now they're serving idols, and unlike the period of Judges, they've got tremendous wealth because they got this huge temple with all this gold. So they're really in a bad situation. You could almost say like that temple, that Solomon's temple, if it's used for evil, is sort of like the Tower of Babel, in that it's got all this wealth in it, but then they're using it to worship Satan, even though they're claiming to worship God. And in fact, later on, Manasseh is going to do just that, who is the son of Hezekiah, and that's hundreds of years into the future. But you'll see that in the future. He will set up an image in the temple, like the image that the Antichrist will set up halfway through the tribulation period, and get people that bow down to that. So he's combining the wickedness and the idolatry of Satan with God and that system. utterly corrupt. So that's what it's going to get to. So God, in his foreknowledge, knowing what's happening, that now David accumulates all his wealth and blessings because he's a man after God's own heart. But then Solomon, his heart's turned away from God. And the next generation you're going to see where they've turned away from God. And so God says, well, I'm going to have to do like I did. I created nationalism among the Gentiles, and I had 70 nations. Well, now I've got to create nationalism among Israel. Because if they're one nation united against me and their Baal and Ashtaroth worship, and they've got all this wealth and everything, then they're just going to use that temple as a Tower of Babel, basically, and they're just going to turn away from me, and then all of Israel's going to be lost. So he says, I'm going to create nationalism. So what he does in the days of Solomon's son Rehoboam, shortly after he takes the throne, is that he raises up Jeroboam. And Jeroboam fights against Rehoboam. And basically what God does is he divides the nation of Israel into two nations. The nation of Israel and the nation of Judah. Judah is where Jerusalem is. Judah is actually the largest tribe of the 12 tribes in terms of number of people, at least back then. I don't know about now, but back then. So the nation of Israel is divided into two nations. Israel, which is the northern part, and there are 10 of the 12 tribes. Remember, Jacob, or Israel, had 12 sons, and they were the 12 tribes. And so each tribe had their own duties and things they would do. So now you got the 10 tribes of the north are Israel, and then the two tribes of the south it's called Judah, which is the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin. Judah is the largest tribe in terms of number, and Benjamin is the smallest tribe in terms of number. And so they're just called Judah, I guess, because it's mostly people of Judah. And God is the city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the capital city of Judah. And Jerusalem is where God had the temple. So when Solomon built the temple, he built it in Jerusalem. And God says, for David's sake, for the sake of David, a man after mine own heart, who as far as God is concerned, spiritually speaking, David is going to be the co-regent with Jesus in God's kingdom on earth. So as far as God is concerned, when God appointed David to be king, it was an eternal appointment. Now, obviously, he died, but eternally, David is going to be God's king, along with Jesus, in God's kingdom on earth. So for David's sake, he says, I'm going to dwell in the temple that Solomon built in Jerusalem. He's not going to do it for Solomon. Solomon was serving other gods, and he had 1,000 wives. So he says, I'm going to dwell with Judah. Judah is going to be my people. I'm going to dwell in the temple in Jerusalem. But I'm going to create basically a civil war, a north and a south. You know, that's what we had here. North and a south fought in the Civil War. Well, God creates a north and a south in Israel. The 10 northern tribes of Israel and the 2 southern tribes of Judah. And God dwells in the temple in Jerusalem. We need to understand that's different from today. Because today, the moment that I recognize my sin and trust in Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection as atonement for my sin, I'm given the gift of eternal life. And the Holy Ghost comes and dwells within me. So God dwells within every believer today. We are the temple of God. But Israel, because of their unbelief, he can't dwell within them because they didn't believe the gospel as a whole. So the way he dwells with Israel as a whole, even though most of them are apostate, they're unbelievers, is that he dwells in the temple. And so then the Levite, the priest, goes in there and provides the sacrifices as a covering for the nation as a whole. So then that way, God doesn't destroy Israel. So God says, I'm going to dwell in the temple in Jerusalem, which means that unlike today, if I want to have learned God's word, get it in me, and I want to worship and serve God, I can do that at home. I'm doing it right. I'm worshiping God right now. I'm ascribing worth to God by doing this Bible study while I'm driving here. I can read God's word. Or we can get together as a congregation, whether online or in person. It can be at someone's house. It can be in a building. It don't matter. But since we all have God within us, we're a temple of the Holy Ghost, and we've got God's completed word, and we got the mind of Christ, we can put all those together and grow in the Lord and bring honor to him and worship him through our Bible studies and through using the mind of Christ. So we don't need a physical building. But today, because most people are apostate, they walk by sight and not by faith, they think that the only way they meet with God is in a church. And there's a church on every corner. Well, the way it was in Israel, they didn't have God dwelling within them because they're mostly unbelievers. And so God dwelt in the temple. God met with them in the temple, and the temple was in one location in Jerusalem, which was in the southern part in Judah. Okay, so God raises up Jeroboam. So Solomon's son Rehoboam is the king over all of Israel, all 12 tribes. God, knowing the apostasy and how they will all just go away from God and there won't be a remnant that will be saved unless he creates nationalism within Israel. So he divides the kingdom into the 10 northern tribes of Israel and the 2 southern tribes of Judah. And the way he does it is he has Jeroboam, and he comes and he fights against Rehoboam, and Jeroboam wins the victory to create the kingdom of Israel apart from Judah. So Rehoboam continues. So now you have a divided kingdom, and that's right around 1 Kings 13, I think it is. And so you have a king of Judah, Rehoboam, and you have a king of Israel, Jeroboam. Now, what Jeroboam does, remember, you can't do like today. You can't just say, well, no church around me, no big deal. I've got the Holy Ghost within me. I've got God's completed word. I can study it, or I can just go online and study it with like-minded believers. So I don't need to go to a specific location. But for Israel, they had to go to Jerusalem because that's where God was. So, and they had to do it. By the way, the males, according to the Mosaic law, the males were to appear before the Lord 3 times every year. So, if you're in the northern part of Israel, the northern kingdom, and you believe God, well, then you've got to go down to Jerusalem, which is now in a different country. It's now Judah. It's not Israel, it's Judah. So you got to go to a different country, basically, to meet with God. And if you're a man, you got to do it 3 times every year. So it makes sense then that if you're a Bible-believing, God-fearing person, and you're in the 10 northern tribes, it would make sense that once the kingdom is divided, that you would move to Judah. I mean, it's going to save you a whole lot of trouble. You don't have to go to a different country. You'll be right there. So you want to, just like for me, a job at work. I get a house that's close to where I work because I don't want to be driving 4 hours one way to go to work each day. I want to get close to work, so it saves me time. So practical purposes, someone who lives in Israel would then leave and go down to stay in Jerusalem so they don't have to travel as far when they go to the feasts every year. So knowing that, Jeroboam says, you don't have to do that anymore. So what he does is he builds 2 golden calves, just like they built a golden calf in the book of Exodus and served that and said, these be thy gods which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. Because remember, by this point in the kings under Jeroboam, Israel is apostate anyway. So they're used to, remember Micah, he combined the worship of idolatry with God. Saul continued that. So by now they're used to bowing down to idols and thinking that that's how they worship God. So what Jeroboam does is he sets up 2 temples, one in Dan and one in Bethel, I think is where the other one is. And one is in the northern part of Israel and the other is in the southern part of Israel. And he sets up a golden calf in each one. And he says, well, you don't need to go to Jerusalem for the feast days. Well, you can serve the Lord in Dan or in Bethel. And so you go to the one that's closest to you, and then you bow down to the golden calf, which by then they think that's worshiping God. And so you bow down to that calf, and then you're serving God. And so God is pleased because you're doing the feast days. And so basically what he did was he set up idolatry in Israel to where everybody thought, obviously there are going to be people who don't go along with it, but for the most part, most people thought that the way to serve God is to go to either Dan or to Bethel and bow down to a golden calf. And that's serving God. when actually it's idol worship. But they were fooled into thinking it's okay because the king is the one who did it, and the king is of God because God brought the victory for Jeroboam, so he must be a man of God. But anyway, he leads people astray. And when you're reading through Kings and Chronicles, you'll see many times it's mentioned about them continuing in the sins of Jeroboam. So Jeroboam is specifically linked with idol worship there in Israel due to those golden calves there. And so you're going to have a period for the rest of 1st and 2nd Kings is you're going to see kings that rise and fall both in Israel and in Judah. And there's a whole long list of names and things, and we won't go into all that because it's a Bible overview. But basically, every single king that is in Israel and the 10 northern tribes are evil kings. And they're evil because of the environment they're in. I mean, they grow up serving idols, thinking that they're serving God when they're serving idols. And so not a single person in Israel, it's hundreds of years that pass in this period of the kings. And I don't know exactly. I'd say, probably from the time of the divided kingdom to the time of Babylonian captivity, which we'll go into in a minute, it's probably, I'm going to say 300, 400 years, about that probably. I mean, you could come up with a number. I just don't, I don't have a Bible in front of me, so I can't tell you, but it's like 300 or 400 years where the kingdom is divided between Israel and Judah, and you got different kings that rise and fall. Every single king in Israel is evil because they've got an idolatrous system. And most kings that rise up in Judah are evil as well, because they're in idolatry as well. Rehoboam led them into that. But they still have the temple there, and God still dwells in that temple. And so you do have the occasional good king that comes up and serves the Lord. A lot of times you have the high places and the groves and the idols where they would serve other gods. And so a good king comes up and he destroys all that stuff, except the groves always stay. It seems like that's the one thing they can't get rid of. And it's because there's pleasure in sex. And so they don't want to get rid of their sexual worship. If they could tie sex to a religious thing, I mean, they had temple prostitutes. And so then they can do their evil sexual sleeping around with these other women, but it's okay because it's in service to God somehow. So while they got rid of the Baal worship and the idol worship, they can never get rid of the Ashtaroth stuff. The groves always stayed. But anyway, a good king would rise up every now and then and would tear down the idols and the high places, but the groves would stick around. So the idol worship would still be there. It was usually the king who did serve the Lord, and because he would do it, he'd get a good number of people to do it. But it's not because they did it out of a heart for God. It was just because they want to do what the king says do. I mean, I think a lot of people took the COVID vaccine not because they thought it was a good idea, but because that's what they were told. You don't want to lose your job, you'll take the vaccine. Okay, I'll take the vaccine. Right? A lot of people made that decision. They didn't say, well, this is the best thing for me. They're saying, well, I need a job to survive, I need money, and I need to take the vaccine to get money, so I'll do it. So it seems like that's how it was with these kings. You have a good king rise up, they tear down the images and things, and the heart of the people are still serving these idols in their heart, but you want to do what the king says to do because you don't want to get punished or in trouble, so a lot of them went along with him. So then when that king died off and then it was replaced usually by an evil king again, then they build up those images again and they start worshiping those other idols. And so, but you do have some good kings in Judah, but Israel you don't have any. And so Israel in the 600 BC, somewhere in there, in the 600s, they go into Assyrian captivity, Assyriam, because they're so evil and against God that every one of the kings is evil and they just do all their idol worship. Then God, and they freely worship Baal and Ashtaroth and have sex in these groves as part of their religious worship, sleeping with these temple prostitutes. And so what God does then is he brings them into Assyrian captivity to where they're taken out of Israel, out of the land, and they go into Assyria, and they are captive there for 70 years. And then God brings them back into Israel. Judah goes through the same thing, except they're a little later, maybe 150 years later or so, probably around 490 or 500 BC, somewhere in there, is where they go into Babylonian captivity. The reason Israel went into Assyrian captivity is the Assyrians were the world rulers at the time. And they get conquered by the Babylonians later. And so Israel goes into captivity, Judah goes into captivity 70 years, just like Israel did. But they are in captivity with Babylon, because the Babylonians are the rulers. So you'll hear about Nebuchadnezzar. He was the king of Babylon. He's the one that brought them into captivity. The reason for the 70 years is given at the end of the book of Jeremiah. It is that I mentioned the Ten Commandments, the Sabbath day. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. That they were, when they got manna, they were to, one day out of the week, on that Saturday, they don't pick up the manna. They rest from any labor, and they rest and they honor God. Well, supposedly. Well, God also said that you're also supposed to have a Sabbath year. So he says, if you want to be blessed with good crops and a lot of food in the land, then you work the land for 6 years, and then the 7th year you rest from it. So you don't plant anything. You take a 1-year vacation, and I'll make sure that in that 6th year you have enough crops to survive for the 7th year. So you can take that vacation, and then you give the land its rest. Well, just like people do, they're greedy and figure, well, I can get more money, more economy, bigger house, fancier possessions if I work all 7 years. And so they never did follow that Sabbath year rule. And so God said they were in the land for 490 years and they didn't follow that rule. And so God says you should have had 70 Sabbath years and that you didn't do. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring you captive for 70 years so that the land can enjoy the Sabbaths. Basically, you owe that land rest. That land was not supposed to produce crops once every 7 years. And the land, it's not the land's fault that you sinned and you planted crops. The land couldn't stop you from doing it. But the land deserves to rest. So, God, not only does he have compassion on people, he has compassion on animals. That's why he had Jonah go to Nineveh. And the main reason is because much cattle there. He wanted them to be saved. But he also has compassion on the land. So he says, the land should have rested 70 years. You didn't let it happen. So I am going to make sure the land rests for 70 years. And so Israel, the northern tribes, went into Assyrian captivity for 70 years. And Judah went into Babylonian captivity for 70 years, all due to their idolatry and serving other gods. And then the land had their rest, the Sabbath rest, for the 70 years. And so the rest of the book of 1 Kings, from about the middle part, around chapter 15 or so, when the kingdom is divided, through the end of 2 Kings, covers that time period of these kings in Israel and Judah, and it tells you all the stuff that they did. Some good kings, but most all bad kings in Israel, and probably 2/3 at least of the kings in Judah were evil as well. And then you got in your Bible, coming next up then, are the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. 1st and 2nd Chronicles cover a lot of the same stuff that you read in the Kings, or also in 2nd Samuel, are in 1st and 2nd Chronicles. It's a very similar thing. What it's supposed to be, it's because God wrote it, so it is what it's supposed to be. It's basically the spiritual telling of the history. You got the history under the Kings in 1 Samuel through 2 Kings. And then you've got the same history under the kings of Israel in 1st and 2nd Chronicles. But the difference is God is focusing on his kingdom in 1st and 2nd Chronicles, not on what's not his. So you'll see the history of David will be there, in First Chronicles because David is a man after God's own heart. That's God's kingdom. And Solomon, of course, also as well. But then when you get to the divided kingdom, since God resided in Jerusalem, which is in Judah, which is the two southern kingdoms, then God is with Judah. He's not with Israel. Israel isn't God's people. They're all evil. They're serving other gods. God isn't physically located in Israel. So then what First and Second Chronicles does is it covers the history of Judah. It doesn't cover the 10 northern tribes of Israel because God isn't with them. But First and Second Kings covers a lot of the kings of Judah as well. So you'll have similar stories in Second Kings as you have in, say, First and Second Chronicles. And it's just First and Second Chronicles is just giving you a different emphasis. And so because of that, First and Second Chronicles is probably one of the most overlooked sections of the entire Bible. Because if you are looking for history, a lot of times people go to First and Second Kings, and they're concerned, most of Christianity is concerned, churchianity is concerned with secular history and not spiritual history. So they're going to go to the secular history of the First and Second Kings rather than the spiritual history of First and Second Chronicles. But there are things in First and Second Chronicles that you don't find in First and Second Kings. For example, David numbering the people and that being a sin, and the punishment of that is in First Chronicles. It's not mentioned in the history in 2 Samuel or First Kings. Okay, so the book of 2 Kings and the book of 2 Chronicles end in the exact same place, which is Israel. They go into Babylonian captivity. And then it's starting with the 70-year history in the Babylonian captivity is skipped. And we get some of that in some of the prophets. You get some of that history. But they're not considered God's people. They're not in God's land. So in the history of 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, that's not mentioned. Ezra and Nehemiah then are continuing the history. Ezra 1:1 is the exact same. The first two verses of Ezra are the last two verses of 2nd Chronicles 36. They're the exact same verses to show you we're picking up there. And it's where after the 70 years are over that Cyrus is now the king. Nebuchadnezzar was the king of Babylon. And then Belteshazzar was king after him. Belteshazzar's kingdom, which was his son, was taken over, actually probably his grandson, taken over by Darius the Mede. And so the Medes and the Persians ended up taking the kingdom over Babylon. And Cyrus the Persian is king at the end of the 70 years of Babylonian captivity. So they're actually in Persian captivity, if you want to be technical about it. And so then Cyrus is used by God. He's actually called God's shepherd in the book of Isaiah. He is used by God to bring Israel back, or Judah, I should say, back into the land and to rebuild the temple. And so Ezra covers the rebuilding of the temple, and Nehemiah covers the rebuilding of the wall that goes around Jerusalem. And so you have Ezra and Nehemiah are history books that talk about Israel coming out of Babylon or Persia, whatever you want to call it, after the 70 years and coming into the land of Israel, or I should say Judah, back into Judah. And that generation is a lot more humble. After losing the land, then they say, it's probably not a good idea to serve these other gods. Look at what it got us. So now when they get back into the land, they rebuild the temple and they reaffirm the Mosaic Law covenant with God. They say, we're going to serve God. Ezra is a priest, the high priest at the time. So that's why he's writing about the building of the temple. Nehemiah is just one of the governors, basically, and so he's writing about the building of the wall. There's a lot of opposition to that because the Persians don't want him doing that, but Cyrus, the king of Persia, is chosen by God to give them all the resources they need and to overcome that adversity so that they can rebuild the temple. Now, the glory of the temple there is a lot less than the glory of the temple was under Solomon. And so the people who, remember, they were in captivity for 70 years, so there are some kids they were kids when they went into captivity. They're now seniors, and they have seen the old temple in all its glory. And actually, they didn't see it in all its glory because it had been, a lot of the gold had been taken away during the apostasy of Judah. But they saw what the temple used to be, and then they see the new temple, and then they mourn because it's not as glorious as the old one. And God says, well, yeah, that's good. We don't want you trusting in that stuff. God wants you to trust in Him and to fear Him, not to trust in some building. So God intentionally allows Cyrus to give them plenty of materials to rebuild the temple, but it's not going to be a big, glorious temple, so that God can meet them there. And in fact, before they actually go into Babylonian captivity, the book of Ezekiel records God left that temple, the old temple, because they're into idolatry. And Manasseh, I mentioned him in the book of 2 Chronicles. It gives you the details that aren't given in Kings, is that Manasseh is such an evil king that he creates an image of jealousy. It is not unlike the image of the beast that the Antichrist will set up, and he sets it up in the temple just like the Antichrist will, and says everybody needs to bow down and worship it. Now, I don't think he killed people if they didn't worship it, but other than that, it's exactly what the Antichrist is going to do. And so God, He's out of that temple. He says, I'm not going to be there. You got idols in the very temple that has my name. So in the book of Ezekiel, you see him just leaving. He leaves that temple. So God's presence is no longer there due to their blatant idolatry in the temple that is supposed to be God's temple, and they're serving other gods there. Ezra and Nehemiah, they rebuild the temple, but it's not as glorious as it was. And people that generation there have a renewal back to God during that time. And that's where the history of your Old Testament ends. That's around 400 BC, and that's the last book in your Bible, in the Old Testament, that was written was the book of Malachi, probably, and that was written around 390 BC. So there's at least about a 400-year period where God doesn't speak to Israel between the Old and the New Testaments, and the history of that is not recorded in your Bible. And so the history ends there with Nehemiah, Ezra and Nehemiah being about 400 years before Jesus comes. And that's really the end of any writings of the Old Testament. So Ezra and Nehemiah, you see them coming back into the land, mourning over what the temple used to be, and mourning that they don't have the temple in that glory right now. And so they promise to turn back to God and serve the Lord, which of course they're not going to do, and I'll go into that later. But we're at the end of that history section. Esther is after Ezra and Nehemiah, then Esther. Esther is a time of history as well, but it's like Ruth. It's something that occurs during the Babylonian captivity. Actually, they're in Persia, and it gets to Satan's attack, where Satan almost gets the entire nation destroyed during that time. But yet God uses Esther to where the Jews are able to fight back and defeat their enemies in Persia, and God saves Israel through Esther's faithfulness and belief in God to save them. And of course, if Esther didn't do it, someone else would. But Esther is the story there. She is a very beautiful woman, and as a result, then she is elected to be the queen of the Persia there, of Artaxerxes, who is the king at the time over Persia. And which I think probably is Cyrus, the same name. Artaxerxes just being a title for the king. And so she is there with Artaxerxes, or Cyrus, the Persian, and then she gets the king to allow the Jews to fight back and to keep the entire Jewish population from being destroyed under that Persian rule there, under that Persian captivity. And so the book of Esther is about that. Interesting, the book of Esther is the only book in your Bible that the word God, G-O-D, is not found. But yet, God's working through Israel and His presence there to save Israel is unmistakable. So even though, and it's probably because He left the temple. So even though He left the temple and His presence isn't there, He is still God over Israel. He's still going to leave a faithful remnant, not because Israel did anything, but because of God's faithfulness. And so you see that in God saving the Jews in Esther, even though the word God, G-O-D, is not found anywhere in the book of Esther. Okay, so the next book is Job, which starts a different section. So, and this battery's about out anyway, so we're going to stop there. So we got through Esther. Thanks for watching.